Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be your host for today's conversation. Just under 3 weeks ago, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution to request the opinion of the International Court of Justice on the legal consequences of Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territories. 87 member states backed the resolution, while 26 voted against and some 53 abstained. So today we are asking the question, what can the ICJ do? Joining me to answer those questions is Hugh Lovatt. Hugh is a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He has focused extensively on regional geopolitics and advised European policymakers on the conflict in Israel-Palestine, as well as Western Sahara. He has also done a lot of work on EU's differentiation policy, which seeks to maintain trade and cooperation with the state of Israel, but only within the 1967 borders. Welcome to the show, Hugh. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So if I may, I'd like to actually start off with the EU differentiation policy, given you've done so much work on this, and then move on to the ICJ, the UN resolution regarding the ICJ. So let's, if you can, tell us a bit about that, because I know the European Council on Foreign Relations has a differentiation tracker. And if you can comment on the progress in EU member states in really upholding the policy which they set out to do, which is to differentiate between Israel and the occupied territories. Just give us a quick update on that.
And perhaps let me start by just explaining a little bit more about the differentiation policy. And I would sort of frame it differently. It's not about allowing international communities to maintain ties with Israel, but rather ensuring that bilateral ties with Israel do not in any way benefit Israeli settlements or in any way advance or support or entrench Israel's internationally unlawful actions towards the Palestinians in terms of settlement activity and dispossession of Palestinians. And so this is based on a long-standing tenet of international law. But then more recently, it was the subject of a UN Security Council resolution number 2334 that was passed in December 2016. And so that added an additional requirement by which all bilateral all bilateral agreements, I should say, signed between third states and Israel have to include an explicit wording or explicit paragraph excluding Israeli settlements. So it's really just trying to tighten up enforcement of international legal norms in bilateral relations. So that's sort of the big explanation. And these requirements, it's not just a European requirement, it's international law, so it's something that's incumbent on all third states, whether it's the US or Gulf countries or Asian countries, everyone has the same duty. But because I work for the European Council on Foreign Relations, I obviously focus on European bilateral relations. So I spent a good chunk of time reading bilateral agreements between European countries and the EU with Israel. So I think I must have read about 300 agreements, and each time looking at how each agreement relates to Israel's territory. So is there language in an agreement that actually explicitly indicates that this agreement has to stop at what's called the 1967 Green Line, which is what the international community considers to be Israel's borders. If it does, then that's good from the point of view of differentiation, because it ensures that these agreements don't benefit the settlements. If it doesn't have this language, then there's a huge risk that these agreements are benefiting the settlements and therefore entrenching Israel's violation of Palestinian rights. And so we did that tracker, which you're very kind to plug. And it's a bit of a mixed picture. And we've been very much using this tracker in trying to raise awareness of European duties to exclude Israeli settlements. And we have seen some positive progress over the last few years, but there's a lot of concerns and a lot of work that remains to be done. So very briefly, what I would say is Western members of the European Union, I'd also include the UK as a former member, they have at times made some positive progress to exclude Israeli settlements from their agreements. Most recently, France, for example, announced that it has what's called a treaty on the avoidance of double taxation with Israel. So basically, it's, if you're operating in both the UK and Israel, it ensures that you're not being taxed by both countries, right? And so this is quite a standard agreement. But up until now, a lot of these agreements have been very ambiguous about whether they apply to the settlements or not. So potentially, Israeli, say French nationals who are resident in Israeli settlements could be benefiting from the provisions of this treaty. So finally, the French government announced that actually the settlements and settlers cannot benefit, which is, I think, positive progress. And we've seen this elsewhere. For example, Germany, Denmark, making clear that Israeli settlement entities, such as Ariel University, cannot benefit from their respective research funding. So that's good, but I think there's a lot of questions. So going back to the UK is in the process of negotiating a new free trade agreement with Israel. Past the UK government, it's tough to keep track these days, did say that settlements would not be included. Now, with this new government, Rishi Sunak, I think there's a question, will the new government abide by the promises of the previous Conservative government? And even if they do, how do they actually ensure that this is enforced so that Israeli settlement product cannot benefit from preferential trade tariff? So it can get a bit technical, but so I think there's a big question mark about that. But we've seen also very negative trends. The Trump administration undid a lot of US differentiation policy and moved things in the opposite direction. So now Palestinian products that come from Area C in the West Bank and which are sold in the US have to be sold as made in Israel. This was put in place by the Trump administration, but has been maintained by the Biden administration. So, it can get, this is very much, sometimes it can get very technical and very much in the weeds, but ultimately it's about, is the international community supporting Israeli settlements and Israeli settlers if we were materially and financially and economically. And the last point I do want to say, which is, clearly if you're talking about, say, labeling settlement products, this is not going to end the occupation, but differentiation can extend into other areas, which I think are much more impactful, which would be financial relations between, say, Europe, Israeli banks and the settlements, because Israeli banks are integral to the support of the settlements. And yet European financial institutions have ties with these Israeli banks. So that's one area. But of course, the other one is settlement products, which, even if they don't benefit from preferential trade tariffs, are still allowed to be sold in Europe. And I think, this is a big Palestinian ask, and it's something where governments have been very reticent to make much to actually delve into. So I think, this is kind of where we're at, very much a mixed bag.
You mentioned it's a mixed bag. I'm interested also to find out how much Arab countries, Gulf countries, for example, are benefiting from settlement products. So I think a couple of a while back you commented on or tweeted about this, how the UAE is benefiting from settlement products. Can you shed a bit light on that?
That's a really good question. And so what we've seen since the signing of the Abraham Accords in September 2020 is the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco moving quite quickly to negotiate agreements with Israel. So again, agreements to do with the avoidance of double taxation, protection of investment, and also the big thing, which is always a free trade agreement. Now, a lot of these agreements have been signed and have not yet been made public. But those that have been made public, I think, are extremely concerning from the point of view of the support that they do provide to Israeli settlements. So we've seen the agreement signed between the UAE and Israel relating to protection of and promotion of bilateral investment, and also the avoidance of double taxation. And when you look at the wording of these agreements, there's very specific wording in terms of how it defines Israel's territory. And it does this by referring to territory under Israel's jurisdiction. Now, for anyone very much in the weeds of the Oslo Accords and Israel's occupation, that is, I think, quite clearly code for Area C, which was placed under Israel's civil and security jurisdiction, at least temporarily under the Oslo Accords. And so the way I read the agreements is quite clearly and deliberately opening a door for their application to the settlements. So put differently, Israeli settlers and Israeli settlements, in my view, are benefiting from the provisions of UAE-Israel agreements. Now, we haven't yet been able to see the free trade agreement between the UAE and Israel, which has been signed. I'm sure at some point we will, and we can actually make our own minds up in terms of how it applies. But based on the language included in the previous agreements, I think there is a big question, or there's a big risk that this free trade agreement will again apply to the settlements, so that Israeli products, Israeli settlement products, will not only be able to be sold in UAE, but will be able to benefit from preferential trade tariffs. And I think there's one further basis for what I'm saying, which is the fact that Israeli settlement products are already sold in the UAE. So when you go through Dubai airport, you can buy Israeli wine produced in settlements in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. And I think so, everyone says, well, Israel's been one of the big, quite logically, Israel has been one of the major beneficiaries of the Abraham Accords. I actually think it's the Israeli settlements that have been far, far greater benefactors of it. And actually they were amongst the Israeli settler businessmen, business lobby groups were actually amongst the first Israeli delegations to go to the UAE right after the signing of the Abraham Accords. So we can talk about other aspects of the Abraham Accords and how it may or may not be beneficial for the respective countries, but I think it's quite clearly damaged Palestinian rights, and I would say also further reinforcing Israel's unlawful behavior and international unlawful practices in the Palestinian territories.
Thanks for that update. I think it is quite a technical subject, but people are interested to hear about it, especially given how the UAE justified the Abraham Accords, saying that this was really to stop annexation, de jure annexation of the West Bank, and now realizing that they're actually benefiting the settlement enterprise would be quite shocking to a lot of people. But let's turn to the main subject for today, which is, as I mentioned, the UN vote to request an advisory opinion from the ICJ. You asked, following the General Assembly vote, you asked, after years of diplomatic inertia, what can the ICJ offer the Palestinians? What can they offer the Palestinians? And more importantly now, why now? After all these years, it's been quite a long time. I think 2004 when the ICJ issued an opinion on the wall. So why specifically now has the UN requested the ICJ? So just give us a bit of a background to that, if you may.
So the idea of going back to the ICJ for a second opinion has been around for a number of years and been debated in expert circles. But the timing, the decision to go now, I think has a lot to do with political dynamics. And largely, it's largely a decision of President Mahmoud Abbas himself. It's quite clear that he's grown increasingly frustrated and perhaps even alienated from the international community and the US and others who he's made quite clear his frustration that they seem to have disengaged and are no longer playing the kind of role that they have previously played. And so having failed to get, in my view, a positive response from the US and Europe on other things that he wanted. So relaunching negotiations, for example, or actually they themselves taking measures to enforce at least a degree of accountability towards Israel and Israeli actions. Having failed to obtain that, he's moved to what could be seen as more of a nuclear option, which is the ICJ path. And I also think, we can't disassociate the timing from the election of Israel's most far-right government in its history. So I think these two things, the Israeli political dynamics and what we can, I think, is quite fair to say is international apathy are the two main reasons for Abbas' decision to go now.
So what makes this one specifically unique? Because we know that there are 3 investigations, legal cases pending with regards to Israel. You have the UN Commission of Inquiry, which is actually looking in to see if Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. So that's an ongoing investigation. There's another ongoing investigation, which is by the International Criminal Court, which is stalled slightly following the appointment of Khan, the new prosecutor, and now the ICJ. So what differentiates the ICJ, say, for example, from the ICC, 2 institutions which are really in the same city? What distinguishes them?
So I think each of these 3 mechanisms that you've described does something a bit different. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which was set up in like 1945, something like that. So it's very much integral to the United Nations itself. That looks at international law disputes between states. So it looks at state responsibility. And it can rule on disputes between states, but it can also provide non-binding advisory opinions on specific issues relating to international law. Now, when it comes to the International Criminal Court, which is, as you said, also based in The Hague, and the ICC is somewhat newer, established under what's called the Rome Treaty in 1998. It actually looks at international criminal law. And instead of looking at states, which the ICJ does, it looks at individuals. So it is designed to try individuals for international law crimes. So that means crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, these sorts of things. So that's, it's a slightly different emphasis. And then the UN Commission of Inquiry, again, is something a bit different. That was set up by the UN Human Rights Council, and it's composed of 3 experts in international law and human rights law, and its mandate is actually far broader. So it was tasked with looking at investigating all possible violations of international law in both Palestine and also in Israel, and also looking at the possible causes for the conflict and tensions. And so one of the criticisms that has been leveled by the UN Commission of Inquiry is actually this is a very broad mandate, and so it allows the commission to do basically whatever it wants, or look at whatever it wants. So yes, I said 3 slightly different emphasis from each of these 3 mechanisms. You're muted.
Yes, so as I was saying, some will say we have been here before 2004 when the ICJ issued an opinion and overwhelmingly voted to say that the wall was illegal and asked the international community to take actions against the wall. But nothing's really happened since. So what could change? What is the difference now? Of course, the global reality has changed. But do you expect that there would be greater emphasis given how much Israel has moved to the right, and given also we have a number of organizations, especially human rights organizations, saying that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid? So are we in a different context to say that no, this time the ICJ ruling could have a bearing or some impact?
The first point one could make is that the questions that the court has to investigate are slightly broader than the previous opinion in 2000 and 2004. So in the previous ruling, it focused merely on the effect that the construction of Israel's West Bank barrier had. And at the time, the court found that where the barrier was built in the West Bank on Palestinian territory, that was akin to de facto annexation of Palestinian territory. But that was the limit of what the court was mandated to look at. So very limited. As you said at the beginning of this podcast, the court now actually is tasked with looking at something much more broader and more fundamental, which is the legality of Israel's presence in the Palestinian territory. So in other words, is its presence actually illegal under international law? And the second question that it has to address is what would be the responsibilities of other states to bring to an end this unlawful situation? So that has potentially far more bearing and far more repercussions were it to find, as I said, that its presence is not only unlawful, but that its actions are tantamount to potentially de facto or de jure, that is formal annexation of all of the West Bank or Palestinian territory. And as you alluded to, it would be making such a ruling in a slightly different international context, where this talk of annexation or apartheid is now becoming increasingly mainstream, thanks to the work of a number of Palestinian and international human rights organizations, and also the findings of other experts, including UN experts. So there is clearly a growing international awareness and appreciation of the extent to which Israel's actions in Palestine are an egregious violation of international law. But what hasn't necessarily changed is the international willingness to do much about it. And so I think this comes to like a big question about, so we don't quite know how the court will rule, but if it does rule in the way I said it might, so about saying Israel's presence is unlawful and this is annexation, would that actually create sufficient pressure, or put sufficient pressure on countries such as the UK, France, Germany, US to do something about it? And on that specific point, I'm unfortunately far more skeptical. But I think the history, and we can talk about this later, that history does indicate that actually there is still some sorts of optimism.
Do you think there's risk associated? Because you mentioned that the remit is wider now. The judgment could be harsher in some ways. So are there risks involved there for the Palestinians as well, for seeking or maybe reaching too much in getting the ICJ and the international community to basically say that Israel's presence itself in the occupied territories is illegal? So are the Palestinians reaching too much, and could there be negative consequences as a result?
It's definitely a game of expectation management, I think, and this is to a certain extent being one of the reasons why Palestinians have not gone to the ICJ for a second ruling to date. In that, when you speaking to Palestinian legal experts and Palestinian officials years ago, they were quite clear that they weren't sure whether the benefits outweighed the risks. So even if they got a positive judgment, would it really say anything much different to the previous ruling? Now, political context dictates, or the political context has obviously led Abbas to go there, as we talked about. But now that they're there, yes, we'll have to, I think, address this sort of cost-benefit ratio. And again, it's very difficult to exactly know how the court will rule. I think it's safe to say that the court will probably be, or has a tendency to be more erring on the side of caution or legal conservatism when it comes to its rulings. And we can say that because, not just because we've seen its previous ruling with regards to the West Bank barrier, but also we've seen its rulings in other cases going back decades, such as South Africa's occupation of Namibia and other cases like that. So we kind of know sort of the logic, but we also know what's called the jurisprudence of the court. So what are the previous cases that the court and its judges will refer back to in constructing a new opinion? And so one of the risks is that the court may not go as far as talking about apartheid. And this is, this would clearly put it a little bit at odds with where international human rights organizations and Palestinians are, which is very much that this is apartheid. And so one of the risks is it could perhaps maybe slow some of the momentum or some of the legal momentum in that direction. And likewise, where it's been even more conservative to date is on the question of third state responsibilities. So what would be the obligations of countries to intervene? And historically, it has tended to say very, very little, and actually has preferred to leave this question up to sort of what you call the political bodies of the UN, which is the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. So both in terms of its substance and recommendations that may fall below what some Palestinians may hope for, but it doesn't mean that its ruling will be unimportant or negative, because it still has the potential to pull the rug from under the feet of Israel's occupation by deeming its presence there to be illegal. And even that, while it may seem actually, a bit of a letdown, considering it's not going to talk about apartheid and these sorts of things, but actually saying that Israel's presence there is unlawful and has to be brought to an end, I think is actually, although it sounds very bland, I think it's actually would be quite a huge thing for it to say, because it would challenge a lot of Israel's own, maybe you could say, bad faith assertions that its presence there is temporary, or that it's acting there in accordance with, I don't know, its interpretation of international law, etc., etc. So I do think, if the court does say that, then it does create perhaps new legal and political avenues that could be explored by the Palestinians.
I mean, you've advised European EU countries on a number of issues. I mean, what's your sense at the moment? Are they concerned about the opening of an investigation, the advisory opinion? Because some would, I mean, you alluded to that in your article as well, the hypocrisy, given that this vote has been conducted under the shadow of the, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I don't think you can get a better clarity about the hypocrisy of the West when it comes to this issue. So what are their main reasons for opposing it? Some I know have said that this undermines the peace process, the same rhetoric which they've repeated over and over again. So what are the main reasons for opposing this vote?
Clearly, the response of European countries to this vote is one of, one could politely say, massive double standards. At a time when European countries talk about how important international law is in the context of Russia's occupation and annexation of Ukraine, to then not be able to follow through on those pronouncements when it comes to a different country which happens to be an ally, such as Israel, I think shows that the very problematic relationship that Europe and the West in general has with international law. It's very much what I'd call a la carte sort of approach. So you sort of pick when you want to apply it. It's easy to do it when it's against a foe like Russia, but very difficult to do it when it's a friend like Israel. And I think we need to be quite clear that this is ultimately, these are ultimately political and geopolitical decisions that factor into how European countries and others will vote. As I said, Israel is a strong ally of Western countries, and so Western countries have little incentive, unfortunately, in the world we live in to actually do much to enforce accountability over Israel's action towards the Palestinians at a time when, I think we need to recognize that, unfortunately, Palestinians have been very much weakened on the international stage. And I think, unfortunately, also falling into a degree of political irrelevancy. It doesn't mean the cause is not important, of course, but I think the weight the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian leadership has on the international stage is not what it once was. So it's very easy for Europe and the West to brush off Palestinian rights, Palestinian aspirations, justice for Palestinians in the name of realpolitik and geopolitics. But what is interesting, and I think is even more in bad faith, is the arguments that these countries deploy. So they can't just say, well, we're doing this for realpolitik. You have to find other excuses, right, to justify your positions. And I think as you said, there's basically two reasons that are evoked. One is, I'm paraphrasing, but basically this would be very unfair on Israel because Israel's not consenting to the court's ruling. And so this would just be very problematic. And the second one is this would hurt the peace process. Now, I think it's quite clear that both arguments are pretty outlandish, especially in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, at a time when Germany, which voted against the ICJ referral, is now calling for a special tribunal to try Russian war crimes. I think that's the best example of the double standards in terms of how countries approach international law. But the final point is, it clearly also reveals a complete fiction, perhaps a willful fiction, in terms of pretending to understand or how one describes the situation on the ground in Israel-Palestine. So this idea that the biggest threat to the peace process, which is, by the way, obviously over and dead and has been dead for years, that the biggest challenge to this could be Palestinians resorting to their international legal rights through the ICJ. But that's the biggest challenge, and not decades of Israeli oppression, Israeli human rights abuses, and settlement expansion, or at least or treating both as similarly problematic. I think that's quite clearly not just wrong, but from a policy and moral stance, but it's also completely at odds with reality and where we are today. And so I think what I would end on this is to say that ultimately Europe's response, the fact that it has double standards is not surprising, although it is disappointing. But what its stance also reveals is its complete is the complete bankruptcy of its own foreign policy towards the conflict, and that unless it can actually stop, unless it's willing to confront the reality on the ground, such as it is, which is apartheid and annexation, unless it's actually willing to rethink the basis for its policy, I don't see how Europe and other countries can actually play a positive role in trying to bring the occupation to an end.
Yes, finally, we will end on this. So what next? What's the next? How long will it take to conduct this investigation, get a judgment and opinion? So do you know the timeline as to when we can actually expect a decision?
That will be for the court and its judges to decide, and they'll set a timeline. But based on previous opinions, we could have a ruling by the summer. It could take longer, but potentially, yes, in the next 6 months. I think that the questions that it will have to look at are, I think, reasonably well known, and I don't think there's anything too difficult that the court will have to deal with. Politically difficult, but from a legal point of view, I think it's quite clear cut. And so it probably won't need too much time to do that.
We have come to the end of our time. I mean, I really appreciate you for joining us for this conversation. And thank you at home for joining us, and hope to see you again for another MEMO conversation. Have a good evening, and bye-bye.